The Ryzen 5 2400G was part of the first generation of APUs on the AM4 socket. Like with the later APUs that would then grace the AM4 platform, it was seen as an acceptable stopgap solution during the scalper pandemics due to its integrated GPU. I don't really think that this is the case, and I tried pointing that out in a couple of videos where I compared another APU with its fully fledged CPU. And just like then, as you'll see from its specs, the APU had to compromise a bit on the CPU side of things, and this can be easily seen when comparing the 2400G with the 1500X we reviewed a few weeks ago. The L3 cache for the 2400G at only 4 MB is down to a quarter of the 16 MB that the 1500X enjoys. The number of PCIe lanes available to the GPU is also reduced from 16 to 8. While this will not lead to a catastrophic loss of performance, it will add about 5% to the performance penalty. Now, there is only one way to see if all of these compromises were worth it in order to get an iGPU going, and that is through benchmarking. What you should get for most of the games is two sets of results, one for the CPU with comparisons to the Ryzen 5 1500X, and then one for the iGPU. The test system using the aforementioned APU also relies on 32 GB of DDR4 running in dual channel at 2933 MHz. When testing the CPU side, I paired each CPU with an RX 580. Because the RX 580 GPU is not that fast, testing for CPU bound scenarios is done at the lowest resolution I could dial in. And since the fully fledged Ryzen 5 1500X was tested under the same conditions, we also have a good comparison part. When testing the iGPU, however, I went for native 720 resolution most of the time, in an effort to get playable frame rates while still being able to discern some details on the screen. As for IPC improvements, we'll be using a video rendering test to see how the CPU part of the 2400G matches against other Zen CPUs. But that's for after the gaming results. And we start off with Marvel Rivals. Testing the CPU means 720 resolution, low settings and the lowest resolution scale available. The CPU part of the 2400G managed an average of 104 FPS and 82 for the 1% lows. This is almost 30 FPS less on average than the 1500X, but about 3 FPS more for the 1% lows. The iGPU was tested at the same settings except for the resolution scale, which was set to 100%. As expected, it performed far worse than the CPU, with 31 FPS on average and low 20s for the 1% lows. For Cyberpunk 2077, we are going to examine the CPU performance first, meaning an eye-damaging combination of lower settings, 1024 by 768 resolution, and FSR performance. The 4 cores of the 2400G managed 83 FPS with 1% lows in the low 50s. This allows the 1500X a 13 FPS lead for the average and a 20 FPS lead for the 1% lows. And all this to allow an iGPU that can average in the low 30s and with 1% lows in the 20s at 720 resolution and low settings. The results for Arc Raiders managed to surprise me. This is the first instance when the CPU of the 2400G managed to outperform the 1500X. At 720 resolution, lower settings and a 50% resolution scale, the APU managed 75 FPS for the average and low 40s for the 1% lows. This allows it a lead over the 1500X of 15 FPS for the average and 11 FPS for the 1% lows. As for the iGPU, I tested at 720 native, and the poor Vega managed 38 FPS for the average and low 20s for the 1% lows. Fortnite turned out to be the first game where the iGPU achieved playable frame rates. But before we get into that, the CPU results first. At 720 resolution, 50% render scale and performance mode, the CPU cores of the 2400G managed 126 FPS for the average and 71 for the 1% lows. A bit better than the 1500X, but not by much. As mentioned earlier, at 720 native and performance mode, the iGPU averaged 86 FPS and provided 60 FPS for the 1% lows. And this time around, the results are not that far off from the CPU side of things, making the APU a viable option. Control was tested in a similar manner and managed another surprise on the CPU side of things. The resolution used was 960 by 540 with the lowest quality settings. The 4 cores that the 2400G has delivered 171 FPS on average and 76 FPS for the 1% lows. This is better than the 1500X by almost 20 FPS on average and 10 FPS on the 1% lows. The iGPU lagged far behind the CPU. and at 1280 by 720 it averaged in the mid-30s with the 1% lows in the low 20s. Rainbow Six Siege, however, has the CPU side of the Ryzen 5 2400G lag behind the 1500X. 161 FPS on average and 120 for the 1% lows, compared to the 1500X's 210 FPS on average and 158 FPS for the 1% lows. The iGPU is, again, the weaker part of the APU, and at full-scale 720 and low settings, the average FPS stays in the mid-60s, while the 1% lows is in the mid-50s. Both CPUs performed almost identically in Doom Eternal. The CPU bound testing was done at 800 by 600 low settings, and both CPUs, when paired with the RX 580, averaged 193 FPS. The 1% lows was around 140 FPS, plus minus 3 FPS. The Vega iGPU, however, was tested at 720 low settings, and is far from being bottlenecked by the CPU side. It averaged 62 FPS with the 1% lows in the high 40s. Okay-ish to actually play the game, but as I mentioned already, far from what the CPU can deliver. Apex Legends is another game that has me eating my words when bashing APUs. This is because at 720 resolution and low settings, the CPU side of the 2400G averaged 213 FPS and produced decent 1% lows at 138 FPS. This is about 20 FPS more than the 1500X on average and 15 more for the 1% lows. But if you play the game on the iGPU, then the CPU is going to be the least of your worries, since at the same settings it averages only 82 FPS with 1% lows in the high 50s. Far Cry 6, however, decided to prove me right. At low settings, 720 resolution and 50% render scale, the 4 hyper-threaded core of the 2400G averaged only 71 FPS compared to 85 for the 1500X. The 1% lows were also in the favor of the Zen CPU, which managed 64 FPS compared to the 55 FPS for the Zen Plus APU. As for the integrated graphics, native 720 resolution has it averaging 40 FPS with 1% lows in the mid-30s. This makes the game playable on the iGPU, albeit fully GPU limited. Overwatch 2 decided to one-up the previous title in terms of punishing the APU for its compromises on the CPU side. At 720 resolution and 50% render scale, when paired with the RX 580, the APU averaged only 224 FPS. And I say only because the 1500X is almost twice as fast. And this trend is maintained also for the 1% lows, with the 2400G managing only 112 FPS, about half of what the 1500X got. But with an iGPU that at 720 native averages 93 FPS and gets the 1% lows at 53, the performance of the CPU core is not really relevant. Resident Evil 4 teams up with the previous two titles when it comes to the CPU performance of the 2400G. 80 FPS for the average and 41 FPS for the 1% lows is fine for the APU, in total vacuum. But then the 1500X averages 115 FPS, and the 1% lows are close to 70. Yeah. Despite using the RX 580 at resolutions that are reminiscent of the DOS era, the 2400G is that bad. But then again, if you bought this chip to use it with the integrated graphics, then the performance of the CPU core is relevant. At 37 FPS for the average and 14 for the 1% lows, your GPU-bound gaming experience can be described as choppy, to put it mildly. Counter-Strike 2 has too much variation when testing using bot matches, so the differences between the two CPUs don't mean that much. At low settings, 720 resolution and balanced FSR, both CPUs manage average frame rates in the 120s when paired with the RX 580. The 1% lows land somewhere between mid-60s and low 70s. The performance of the iGPU is actually fine at 720 native resolution. It manages 89 FPS for the average and 58 for the 1% lows, and successfully bottlenecks the system. The canned benchmark in Borderlands 3, however, avoids the variations mentioned with CS2. Still, the difference in the performance between the two CPUs, when paired with the RX 580, is quite small. At very low settings, 720 resolution and 50% render scale, the two CPUs provide an average FPS in the low 80s, and 1% lows in the 50s. As for the integrated graphics, it manages playable frame rates starting with 1600 by 900 resolution and very low settings, with the average FPS at 42 and the 1% lows at 36. 720 resolution will increase these numbers, but you'd still be GPU limited. In pretty much all recent videos, DOTA 2 is firmly CPU bound at 1080 resolution and low settings. This upper performance limit is at about 75 FPS on average and 43 FPS for the 1% lows. This is slightly lower than the 1500X can provide, but not by a lot, about 6 FPS on average. The IGPU, however, manages to write a new chapter in the history books by getting the system GPU bound with its performance, just 56 FPS for the average and 31 for the 1% lows. Both CPUs were tested in the finals at 720 resolution, lowest settings and 50% render scale. The CPU side of the Ryzen 5 2400G manages 102 FPS for the average and 67 FPS for the 1% lows. However, the 1500X did better, 121 FPS for the average and 73 FPS for the 1% lows. And just like with each game in this video, the iGPU manages to get the system not GPU bound but GPU anchored at 53 FPS on average and 38 FPS for the 1% lows, at native 720 resolution. In a similar fashion, Shadow of the Tomb Raider was tested at a ridiculous 800 by 600 and very low settings to get a CPU bound scenario. The APU managed 92 FPS on average and 40 FPS for the 1% lows. And again, the 1500X did do better with 113 FPS for the average and 57 FPS for the 1% lows. The iGPU fails to get the 1% lows above 30 FPS, even at 720 resolution and low settings, but with the average FPS at 37, the performance is somewhat acceptable for this slow-paced game, and a clear top limit imposed on the system. The CPU performance in Terminator resistance is similar for both chips. At the 1024 by 768 resolution, low settings and 50% render scale, the Ryzen's averaged around 200 FPS and provide 1% lows of mid-90s. 1080 resolution and low settings has the iGPU providing playable frame rates at 44 FPS for the average and 30 for the 1% lows. GPU bound but playable. The video rendering test that I used to gauge IPC improvements consists in timing how much it takes to encode the video review of an R9 270. The time then gets multiplied with the number of cores and the average frequency to get an approximate number of clock cycles needed to finish the work. The lower the number, the better the IPC. In the case of the 2400G, the rendering took 1249 seconds, translating, due to the average core frequency of about 3.4 GHz, to 17,518 billion clock cycles. This then puts it within margin of error to the Ryzen 5 1500X, pointing out that 1. The two CPUs use basically the same cores, and 2. The L3 cache doesn't seem to influence that much video encoding tasks. The iGPU that comes with the 2400G is not much faster than an R7 265. And back then, the used R7 265 would go between 20 to 40 USD. Definitely cheaper than the 60 USD that AMD demanded for the integrated graphics. To add insult to injury, the CPU cores were stripped by most of the L3 cache that definitely seemed to have helped the fully fledged Ryzen 5 1500X, at least in gaming. The APUs were touted as stopgaps during the 2020 years, but to me it seems that the iGPU made sense if you played the games of 2018 or older, and with the reduced count of PCI lanes available for a dedicated GPU, I can't see why you'd keep the APU after finally buying the DGPU you dreamed of. Anyway, I'm sticking to my opinion that outside applications where space is at a premium, APUs will always be outperformed by a combination of a similar CPU and a used discrete graphics card. Okay, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it and I'll see you for the next one.